Sometimes you just have to conclude that Jesus was a bit stupid. Today's story, when you actually stop to think about it for a moment, may well be one of those moments when you have to conclude that Jesus was just a little dense. Jesus rides into Jerusalem in a great procession on the back of a young donkey that no one else has ever ridden. We've all seen the pictures, Jesus riding in serenely on the submissive borrowed donkey's back. The crowds laying their cloaks on the road to make an improvised red carpet, while others climb trees to cut down palm branches and wave them as they cheer. A triumphal procession where it seems that Jesus has finally been recognized for who he truly is, the King of all kings and the Lord of all lords, Israel's Redeemer, the great Lion of Judah, the Messiah, the Christ. Hosanna, the cry goes up. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna to the Son of David. So why is it that I suggest Jesus was being moronic? Imagine for a moment how that scene could have looked if, as Jesus approaches the gate in the city, the young donkey gets startled and bucks, throwing its rider to the ground, or perhaps just simply stops still and refuses to move. And yet Jesus risks that by telling his disciples specifically to bring him a donkey that has never been ridden, never been tested. Donkeys and horses are not automatically safe to ride. They need to be broken in. They need to be broken in by being ridden in a controlled environment first, and then once they're green broke, they need to be slowly introduced to the wider world so that they won't get startled. If that donkey had misbehaved as Jesus made his entrance, it would have made for a very, very different story. The majesty of that event would have completely evaporated in a moment. After a little momentary surprise, the crowd would have ended up jeering while the children laughed and pointed at him. We've probably each seen some of the TV images of that sort of thing, of perhaps one of the horse guards as they progress down the mall following a mounted band to the trooping of the colour, when the horse gets startled, and even if the rider manages to stay on the horse's back and it doesn't go charging off all on its own, even if the rider manages to stay on and grip with his hands and with his knees and stays there, yet still the grandeur of that moment is lost. And all that's remembered of that procession and that particular year's trooping the colour is not the majesty and the grandeur and the pomp and the ceremony. It's the guy who couldn't control his horse. To my mind, that scene was put at risk by choosing an unbroken donkey. To my mind, that scene would have been so much better planned if Jesus had instead chosen a well-trained white stallion, a war horse accustomed to noise and distraction, tall and solid, raising Jesus high above the crowds that he could be seen. But I know that wouldn't have been possible, and not just because white stallions are much less commonly found around for borrowing than a humble donkey, but because there was that prophecy in Zechariah that we read earlier that dictated this scene, and it had to be fulfilled. Jesus did had to ride in on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. But Jesus does seem to go needlessly one step further, for there's nothing in that prophecy about that donkey being previously unridden. Nothing there that said it had to be unbroken. If you need to ride a donkey, and okay, I'll accept Jesus did need to ride a donkey, but if you do need to ride a donkey, you don't choose a jittery colt that's not used to the distractions of the world, nor do you choose one that's unaccustomed to the weight of someone on its back. You choose one that's been fully broken in. At the very least, you perhaps choose one that's used to carrying a load. Especially if you're going to be riding through cheering crowds that are waving branches and cloaks in its face. The fact that Jesus safely rode that young colt in that procession as the people crowded in and shouted and waved branches is a miracle in itself. Perhaps it proves that Jesus really is the Lord of all nature. But if I'm honest, it seems a pretty pointless and fairly underwhelming miracle. As miracles go, it's surely too much effort for him to have used his divine authority for too little payoff. After all, if it is a miracle, it's not in the same league as making blind men see or feeding 5,000 men plus the women and the children. It's certainly not in the same league as turning water into wine. In fact, I could imagine that if there was going to be a miracle, many of the people in that crowd that day would have preferred that he turned the water in their flasks into the very best wine. It would have certainly made for a much merrier crowd as he arrived into Jerusalem. Jesus would have probably done much better by just choosing a better miracle. Or maybe, much simpler, choosing a different colt. So perhaps we're missing something. Let's think about Jesus' day up to this point. When I was preparing my message for this morning, I realised that I'd actually missed quite a bit of the story of this day. For quite a bit happens before Jesus arrives in Jerusalem. It was a busy day, a very busy day, and he starts it setting off from Zacchaeus' house. You remember the story of Zacchaeus? For Jesus had eaten his tea there the night before. He and his disciples are probably part of a much larger group, for everyone was travelling to Jerusalem for the Passover celebration. That's why there'd been so many in Jericho. That's why Zacchaeus had to climb the tree. And as Jesus travelled that day towards Jerusalem, we're told that he did a handful of healings as he walked, a handful of other miracles en route. He got annoyed with a fig tree for not having figs despite not being fig season. Must have been a bit tired and ratty, maybe not a good bed at Zacchaeus's. And he told some stories to those people he was walking with. And one of those stories that he tells is the parable of the 10 pounds of silver. A rich man goes away to be made king, and he gives each of his 10 servants a pound of silver each. And when he returns, he asks to see how they've invested it, and he rewards them according to how much profit they've made. All except one servant who's punished by the king, since he had hidden what he had in a handkerchief which he buried, and he'd done nothing with his silver. It's a similar story to the parable of the talents, but with a few subtle differences. In this case, the servants are all given the same amount, and it is a much, much smaller amount. Even at today's inflated silver prices, it would only have been worth about £150 that he gave to each of them, but back then, the small silver coin would have been worth the equivalent of perhaps £12. He wasn't giving them much, rather than the many thousands of pounds in the parable of the talents. But here also, these servants are specifically told that they must do business with what they've been given. With that parable, Jesus is looking ahead, past the cross, past the tomb, and hinting at his imminent departure, when he would go and receive his kingship and would reign until some future time known only by the Father, when he would return to earth in glorious triumph. And while he's away, he will give his servants gifts to carry on his work until he returns. The message he's giving, we're not called to simply sit back and wait for the kingdom to come. There's work to do. We are facing an unfinished task. And to accomplish this task, each believer receives a gift of equivalent worth. No distinction, not some with really good gifts and some with quite rubbishy ones. You and I receive gifts from God worth just as much as St. Paul received. Joe Christian and Jane Believer receive the same as William Booth or Billy Graham. And we all have the same command. Put this gift to work until I come back. I don't know about you, but that idea of all of us being given equivalent gifts to each other is not always a comfortable one, as most of us have a tendency to look around at others and compare ourselves. We see the fantastic intellect of one person, the real administrative gifts of another, the quiet, unswerving dedication of this one, or the natural ease of caring and loving of that next. And then we think that what we've got is not up to their standard. We put a hierarchy of gifts in place, and in every aspect, when we look at what we have, we see someone better. Because there's always someone better at something than us. Even the most fantastic musician, able to play perhaps piano, violin, xylophone, guitar, bugle, tambourine, kazoo and swanee whistle, will still be able to find someone better than them on the bassoon. So we look down on the gifts that we've been given, and we consider them to be of small and paltry value. We think it's not good enough that our resources lie in a willingness to do the washing up without moaning, or in telephoning the lonely, or praying for the sick, or just listening to the hurting, or playing with toddlers, or being a solid and dependable second baton. And so we fail to do business with what God has given to us. We fail to do God's business with the resources that he's handed out. God cannot have need of what I have got to offer, we tell ourselves, forgetting that it was he who gave us those gifts, skills, talents and passions in the first place, specifically so that we could invest them in his service. Forgetting that he gave us just the right gifts for just the job that he had for us. Like the 10th servant, we say, I don't think that what I can do will be good enough, so I'll do nothing. I don't think what I can do will be good enough, so I'll do nothing. So perhaps then Jesus was not being dim-witted when he sent his disciples ahead to collect an unbroken colt for him to ride. Perhaps he was demonstrating that same point that he'd been trying to teach them as he walked in towards Jerusalem. Perhaps he was trying to find a way of enacting that parable. Because from our perspective, and no doubt from the perspective of the disciples sent ahead, his choice of steed makes no sense at all. It would seem to not be good enough. It doesn't have the necessary experience or stature. It's not had the necessary training. There's the risk that it might fail under a load that's too heavy. A risk that it might be too willful to have someone else take the reins. A risk that it may show itself up. Or worse, the risk that it might show Jesus up. And yet, it is that specific colt that Jesus gives directions to. It is that, to our mind, unsatisfactory animal for which the disciples have been primed with that phrase, the master has need of it. And as it turned out, that ostensibly unqualified colt was more than sufficient to the task. Jesus did a remarkable thing with what we may have thought to be surely inadequate and ill-suited. That young donkey, though appearing not to be up to the task, became a central figure in one of the greatest and best-known stories of the Gospels. One that we celebrate every year. So what if Jesus were to send those two disciples into our hall today? What is there in your life that you may be hiding in a handkerchief or burying in the ground? What skill, talent or passion might Jesus send someone to find? What might they see in your life and point to and say, the Lord has need of that? What needs to be untied so that it may be taken to Jesus and put into his service. One thing's clear. If we sit back and say, I don't think that what I can do will be good enough, so I'll do nothing, then we've missed the point of this passage. There's no such thing as a little gift, because God can take simple things, unbroken, untrained things, and still use them in great ways. Moses was asked to give his walking stick. Rahab gave just a corner of her roof to hide the spies. David gave his slingshot. The widow at Zarephath gave some oil and flour to make a meal for Elijah. The widow gave her mite, and the young boy gave his 5 loaves and 2 fish. And in each of those cases, they put what they had at the Lord's disposal, even though they thought it would not be enough. Even though they thought it may run out, or that it looked foolish, or they might show themselves up, or worse, show God up. They simply gave what they had to the Lord's disposal. Everything that we have has been given to us as a gift from the Lord. Everything. Our time, our talents, our resources, they've been entrusted to us so that we might use them for him. To you it may not seem like much. Your gifts may seem small and insubstantial in your own eyes. You may worry that you risk showing yourself up, showing Jesus up. But if God can do business with an unbroken colt, what can he do with you? If God can do something amazing that's still talked about more than 2,000 years later, with a donkey that had to be tied up so it didn't run away, that had never done anything like this before, then what can he do with you if you untie your gift? What is there in your life that someone can point to and say, that the master has need of that? That skill, that talent, that passion, that block of time that you don't know what to do with and you just sit at home bored. That passion you've never done anything about. That skill that you've not quite put to use in his service yet. What can they look at and say, see that? The master has need of that. Because this passage tells us that the master has need of you. So as we reflect on that, perhaps pray and ask what it is he's calling to us and saying. We sing together. Take my life and let it be consecrated, Lord, to thee. Take my moments and my days. Take my hands, my feet, my voice, my lips, my silver, my gold, my intellect, every power within me, my will, my heart, my love, and most importantly, take myself, and I will be forever and only and all of me, all for thee.